The War of 1812 was a geopolitical conflict between British soldiers and Allied Native Americans against the U.S. located near the U.S.-Canadian border that was caused by the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France, where both nations cut off trade with the U.S. This was important for the natives because it was the first militarized attempt the Native Americans fought back. While the War of 1812 may have been a positive turning point in U.S. history as it elevated the country as a nation and as a world power in high regard from rivaling countries, the Native Americans were in fact the biggest losers. Thanks to post-war events that occurred leading to ancestral trauma, Native citizens may still be feeling those effects to this day. Before the war, the British oppressed the United States and didn't respect the growing nation. In their eyes, the U.S. was still under the British monarchy. The British took their ships, held their seamen hostage, and even had the captains work for the Navy or British Army. It was a real punch in the face to the U.S. by the British, as they were taking whatever they wanted and knew that the U.S. couldn't do anything about it. Until the U.S. decided to take charge, starting with the change in the presidential office. That's right, in 1809, the fourth presidential election occurred, with former President Thomas Jefferson out and newly elected President James Madison in. One of the biggest arguments between Britain and the U.S. was trade. These countries could never agree on anything. This conflict can be traced back to Jefferson, along with Congress passing the Embargo Act in 1807, which closed off all U.S. ports and stopped trade with Britain. As you can see, things were not going well for the U.S. in this period. So when worse comes to worse, you're backed into your corner and you have no other option to do, well, you declare war. At least, that's what the US thought. This war would not only include American soldiers and British soldiers, but also Native allies and enslaved African Americans.
What's going to happen with enslaved individuals, because many enslaved individuals are owned and they are chattel or property, their service or their lack of service in the War of 1812 is going to be dependent upon their owners. It was not uncommon during the American Revolution, during the War of 1812, and later on, even during the Civil War, if white individuals were being called to serve, if they owned enslaved people, they could go ahead and have enslaved people serve in their place.
Now, it wasn't as simple and careless as it make it out to be. There was some extra content to it, but you still have to think, was it even a good decision for the US? Now, obviously now we can say, oh yeah, it's a great decision for them, but there must have been some questions at the time raised at Madison. First of all, Madison was supposed to be a diplomatic peacemaking leader, unlike past presidents before him, so having him turn so quickly to war must have been somewhat intriguing to American citizens. Well, it turns out most U.S. citizens were enthralled by the idea of a second war. They even went so far to call the War of 1812 their second war for independence. Second of all, the U.S. was still in heaps of debt from past wars, like helping the French Revolution and even their own Revolutionary War. So did they even have the funds for this, you might be asking? Finally, the U.S. Army, compared to Britain's, and especially France's, was a steaming pile of hot garbage. Their army was slower, younger, and completely disorganized. They were lucky to even win their first war, and trying to win a second seemed pretty confident themselves. And to pile one more piece of evidence on this mountain of bad luck, can't forget about contracts. Whether it's your mortgage or your car payment, you always have contracts that are signed to keep you in check. And man, did the US have some pretty big ones. The U.S. signed numerous contracts with many Native American tribes, promising them land in North America, which was going to be a problem with westward expansion later on. So, it was official. The U.S. was going to war with Britain. On June 17, 1812, President James Madison officially signed and ratified the Declaration of War on Great Britain, with the British doing the same on January 9th that same year. This time, Britain wasn't alone. They were allied with the Native Americans, who by now were on bad terms with the U.S. Britain was a supporter of the natives, even offering weapons and resources to aid their fight against the U.S. This war was fought on land and sea, with America even having to form a new navy. Now, the U.S. did not start out too hot in the War of 1812, losing a majority of their first battles due to the Army's inexperience. Another factor was their general, William Hull, who made some questionable decisions as general. Like, for instance, on July 12, 1812, he invaded Canada from Detroit, and at first won, but then surrendered with ease once the armed forces arrived. Hull tried to return to Detroit, but was followed and then quickly had to surrender Detroit to the British. Things weren't going that well until William Henry Harrison stepped in as general, raided HMS Java, and finally earned a U.S. victory. Things were actually starting to go well for once, which was shown especially after Madison was re-inaugurated for his second term. It seemed like things were going great for the U.S., but for centuries, Native Americans have been mistreated by the white man, going all the way back to Columbus. Native Americans have always paid the ultimate price for what? Existing. The Native Americans during this time in pre-industrial America were being pushed around, taken out, and just all around treated like dirt. But this time, they wanted to take a stand, and man, did they. This war seemed like all the odds were in their favor. They had the British by their side, a great leader in Tecumseh, and a massive alliance between all tribes. They were ready. Almost all tribes east of the Mississippi were in a big part of the battles that happened against the U.S. This war was the natives' first big stand where it seemed like they had a chance to win. They won battles like the Battle of Wabash and many other battles that helped push out the U.S. from invading and taking native land. All this was achieved by mass support of the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, along with the help of his younger brother Tenskwatawa.
But you have those nations who decide to follow Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa. They ally themselves with the British, and they believe that the British are going to offer better terms if they are the victorious nation. The British make promises to go ahead and respect indigenous land spaces and allow those native nations to go ahead and live as they had done before. They promise to protect them and to protect their lands. The American government does the same thing. So they make the same kinds of promises to other native people to entice them to go ahead and ally with them. So really, these two major powers, the United States and Great Britain, they really divide the native world in two. And so you have these two major factions that develop.
Tecumseh was highly respected around by other chiefs and tribe leaders, especially once he helped conceive an alliance of all remaining native people, by Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, from the prairies of the Midwest to the swamplands of Florida. This multinational tribe alliance was huge for this war because to win and defeat the U.S., they had to all be on the exact same page. Along with Tecumseh and the Shawnee, other tribes helped in the majority of the war, such as the Fox, Chickamauga, Iroquois, Kickapoo, Mascouten, Mohawk, Ojibwe, Piankashaw, Potawatomi, and Sauk. This monumental alliance was called the Iroquois Confederacy. Through this alliance, the Native Americans stood up for themselves and had a good shot to finish the war on a winning side. But sadly, historically, Native Americans don't come out winning. This mainly had to do with the major loss in leadership, the loss in Tecumseh. On October 5th, 1813, American forces defeated British forces and their allies in the Battle of Thame, resulting in the death of Tecumseh and the end of his confederacy. Tecumseh's death dealt a major blow to Native American morale and halted tribal momentum in the war. While the U.S. was entirely focused on beating the British with all their power, the other side wasn't so focused because British, remember, were still in a war with France. So for the majority of the war, the British were only fighting at half power. That doesn't mean they didn't do anything though. One of their biggest stands was on August 24th, 1814, when the British forces bombarded the U.S. Army in Washington, D.C. and raided the Capitol building, burning it to the ground, and if it wasn't for a very lucky rainstorm, the Capitol would have been a pile of rubble. After burning the Capitol, the British turned northwest up Pennsylvania Avenue toward the White House. President Madison, along with many other politicians, fled to Washington to go and seek refuge in Maryland. The British did the same to the White House as they did to many other historical buildings, but not before grabbing a bite to eat in the dining hall. After both burning Washington and many other northeastern states, citizens were getting worried that they might lose this war. With looters and others losing faith in the good old red, white, and blue nation, all of this pain and sorrow brought by the British Army was formidably stunted, however, by the death of great General Robert Ross at the Battle of North Point on September 12th. This good spirit brought Francis Scott Key the courage to write the first lines of a poem that would later become the Star-Spangled Banner. On September 14th of 1814, the War of 1812 was starting to come to a close. On December 1st of 1814, the U.S. sent peace delegates to reconvene at Ghent, and within a span of a few weeks, peace delegates met and participated in the Hartford Convention to discuss a new treaty, signed the Treaty of Ghent, and finally got it ratified by the British on December 28, 1814. The final battle marking the end of the war was the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815. On the days of February 16 through 18 on 1815, the United States ratified the Treaty of Ghent and it was officially declared. The War of 1812 was over. The treaty stated that all territories claimed during the war would be returned to the original owners before the war started, and both countries pledged to work on trying to end the slave trade. However, this would only bring about the final blow to the Native Americans.
This war really has a ripple effect. There's probably not one Native family east of the Mississippi that's not impacted in one way or another.
When the war ended in a draw for the British and the U.S., the British abandoned their native allies, not even backing them up with their lack of money and military. The Native Americans could no longer defend their homelands. The U.S. knew they could exploit this weakness and began expediting land deals among various Indian nations. The U.S. not only negotiated over 200 land agreements that ended with a colossal ending of native lands, but also the permanent instillment of reservations. In the end, all the natives who lost and were unwilling to say goodbye to their homelands were ripped out of their homes. enforced in the Trail of Tears and the Long Walk. The arduous journeys endured by these tribes created generational trauma. In conclusion, while the War of 1812 may have been a positive turning point in the U.S. history as it elevated the country as a nation and as world power in higher regard from rivaling countries, the Native Americans were in fact the biggest losers. Thanks to post-war events that occurred leading to the ancestral trauma, Native descendants may still be in the losers bracket to this day.